Have you ever wondered what it would take to leave your entire world behind for the promise of a dream, no matter the cost? That very question was the driving force for thousands of pioneers in the 19th century, who gazed westward with hearts full of hope for a new life in California. As we begin our story tonight, if you enjoy these journeys into the past, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps us create more tales for you to enjoy. I'm always so curious to know where our community is listening from, so feel free to share what time it is and what city or country you're in as we travel together. Now, find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and allow yourself to settle in for our journey. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we join one of the most famous wagon trains in American history, not at its tragic end, but at its hopeful, sun-drenched beginning, as a dream of a better life begins to take shape on the open plains. It began, as so many great journeys do, with the quiet stirring of ambition in the heartland. The year was 1846, and in the bustling community of Springfield, Illinois, the air was thick with talk of the West. It was a word that held an almost magical quality: California, a land of endless sunshine, fertile valleys, and boundless opportunity. This was the dream that captured the imaginations of two prosperous local families, neighbors and friends, who had decided to risk everything they had built for the chance at something more. At the center of this burgeoning enterprise were two brothers, George and Jacob Donner. George, at 62 years of age, was a man of considerable standing. He was a successful farmer, a man who had spent a lifetime cultivating the rich soil of Illinois and had reaped a comfortable existence from his labor. He was known to be patient, kind, and thoughtful. His younger brother Jacob was much the same, a solid and dependable man, deeply devoted to his family. Together, they represented the steady, hard-working core of the American dream as it existed in their time. Yet, the dream was changing, and so, the idea of a final, grand adventure took root. They were not young men anymore, but the pull of the West was a siren song that transcended age. They began to speak of selling their farms, of liquidating assets painstakingly acquired over decades, and pouring it all into one monumental gamble. They would move their families, their children, and their households 2,000 miles across a continent to a place they had only ever read about in pamphlets and letters. Their friend and neighbor, James F. Reed, was a man of a different sort. Where the Donners were quiet and agrarian, Reed was a dynamic and ambitious businessman. He was wealthy, energetic, and possessed a powerful confidence in his own abilities. He saw the move to California not just as an opportunity for a pleasant retirement, but as a venture, a chance to build a new and even greater fortune in a land ripe for development. Reed did not believe in doing things by halves. His preparations were a testament to his ambition and his wealth. While others were content with standard functional wagons, James Reed commissioned a vehicle of unprecedented luxury for the Overland Trail. It was a custom-built two-story wagon, so large and well-appointed that it quickly earned a nickname among the other emigrants. They called it the Pioneer Palace Car. It was ingeniously designed, with a built-in iron stove, comfortable spring-cushioned seats, and sleeping berths for his family. For Reed, this wagon was more than just transportation. It was a statement. It was a symbol of the comfortable, prosperous life he intended to transplant, not abandon, in the golden lands of California. This powerful impulse to move westward was not unique to the Donners and the Reeds. It was part of a larger, sweeping national mood, a belief known as manifest destiny. This was the widely held conviction that American settlers were not just permitted, but divinely ordained to expand their dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. It was an idea that framed westward expansion as a noble, inevitable, and righteous cause. It transformed a difficult migration into a patriotic pilgrimage. Fueling this national ambition were the popular guidebooks of the era. Small, cheaply printed books with titles promising safe and swift passage to the new Eden. These guides, often written by land speculators and promoters with a vested interest in encouraging migration, became the Bibles of the trail. They spoke of the journey in romantic terms, describing a challenging but ultimately manageable adventure. They often downplayed the immense dangers, glossing over the risks of disease, accidents, and the sheer soul-crushing difficulty of the 2,000-mile trek. To read these books was to believe the journey was a grand excursion. And so, on a cool spring morning, April 16, 1846, the dream took its first tangible form. The initial group that would become the core of the Donner Party assembled on the outskirts of Springfield. It was a small congregation of hopeful souls. Around 32 men, women, and children gathered with their 9 wagons, ready to depart. They had sold their homes, their farms, and their businesses. Their entire fortunes, both financial and emotional, were invested in the contents of those canvas-topped wagons and the strength of the oxen that would pull them. The smell of fresh spring rain hung in the air, mingling with the scent of the damp Illinois soil, a final farewell from the only home they had ever known. The scene was a flurry of controlled chaos and heartfelt goodbyes. The low, patient groans of the oxen filled the morning air, their breath misting in the cool temperatures. You could hear the sharp, rhythmic strike of hammers on iron as blacksmiths made last-minute repairs, tightening wheel rims and checking axles for the final time. The women, in their colorful bonnets and sturdy dresses, made final checks of their provisions, while the men in practical buckskin shouted instructions, their hands feeling the worn leather of the reins, a tangible connection to the future they were about to steer into existence. Their first objective was Independence, Missouri. This bustling frontier town was the main jumping-off point, the last major outpost of American civilization before the trail plunged into the vast, unmapped wilderness. It was here that they would join the great river of humanity flowing west along the Oregon and California trails. But already, a shadow was creeping at the edges of their optimistic plans. The ideal departure time from Missouri was late April. This was a critical deadline, a carefully calculated window that would allow a wagon train to cross the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains in California before the first heavy snows of winter made the passes impassable. They were already pushing this schedule. Their late start from Illinois meant they would be leaving Missouri later than was considered safe. It was a small detail, easily dismissed amidst the excitement of departure, but it was the first of many fateful delays. Inside their wagons, they had packed what they believed would be enough to sustain them: barrels of flour, slabs of cured bacon, sacks of coffee, sugar, and salt. These were the staples. For fresh meat, they would rely on their rifles, and the great herds of game, they were told, roamed the plains. With final farewells spoken and tears wiped away, the small train of 9 wagons lurched into motion. The great wheels began to turn, and the Donner Party, a small gathering of dreamers from Illinois, rolled westward, leaving behind the familiar world of settled towns and plowed fields for the vast, open promise of the American continent. their hearts were full of hope. The journey from Missouri marked their true departure from the world they knew. As they moved on to the Great Plains, the landscape transformed dramatically. The rolling, tree-lined hills of the Midwest gave way to an endless expanse of sky and grass. It was a sight that filled the emigrants with a profound sense of both wonder and intimidation. The prairie was like an ocean, a sea of tall grass that waved and rippled in the wind, stretching in every direction to a horizon that seemed impossibly distant. Life on the trail quickly settled into a demanding and monotonous routine. The days were governed by the sun and the needs of the animals. Long before dawn, the camp would stir to life. The first task was always to find and yoke the oxen. These powerful, patient beasts were the engines of the entire enterprise, and their well-being was paramount. Once they were hitched to the wagons, the train would begin its slow, lumbering progress, aiming to cover between 10 and 15 miles in a day. It was a grueling pace. The wagon train became a moving community, a self-contained village on wheels. For a time, the Donor Reed Group joined a much larger wagon train captained by a man named William H. Russell. This decision swelled their numbers to several dozen wagons, providing a greater sense of security in the vast emptiness of the plains. There was a comforting rhythm to their shared existence, a sense of common purpose that bonded them together against the wilderness. The days were long and arduous. They would travel until noon, when the sun was at its highest and hottest. Then, a brief stop for a midday meal, a chance to rest the animals and themselves before pressing on again until evening. The endless, rhythmic creaking of dozens of wooden wagon wheels became the soundtrack to their lives, a constant companion on the long road west. This was accompanied by the smell of dust kicked up by hundreds of hooves and wheels, a fine powder that coated everything and mixed with the sweet, clean scent of the prairie wildflowers. For the women, the work was relentless. Their duties were not suspended for the journey. They were expected to cook, wash clothes, and care for the children, all within the cramped confines of a moving wagon or during the brief halts. A meal was not a simple affair. It required building a fire from whatever fuel could be gathered, often dried buffalo dung, and preparing food with limited supplies and utensils. Life was a constant battle against dust, dirt, and exhaustion. But there were also moments of simple joy and profound beauty. In the evenings, after the wagons were circled and the animals were put out to graze, the camp would come alive with a different kind of energy. The sound of children's laughter would echo across the prairie as they played games, their energy seemingly boundless. As darkness fell, families would gather around crackling campfires. The comforting aroma of coffee boiling over the open flames would fill the air, and someone might bring out a fiddle or a harmonica. The sound of their songs would drift up into a sky so vast and clear that the stars seemed close enough to touch. And so, as they traveled, they marked their progress by passing famous landmarks that had been described in their guidebooks. These natural formations were like signposts in the wilderness, assuring them they were on the right path. They marveled at Chimney Rock in Nebraska, a strange and delicate spire of clay and sandstone rising hundreds of feet into the air. They passed Scott's Bluff, a massive promontory that loomed over the plains, a welcome change in the otherwise flat terrain. Each landmark was a milestone, a victory ticked off on their mental map of the journey. One of the most awe-inspiring sights for the pioneers was the great American bison, or buffalo. They had read about them, but nothing could prepare them for the reality. They encountered herds so vast that they blackened the plains for miles in every direction. The ground would tremble with the thunder of their hooves. For the emigrants, these massive animals were a vital resource. A successful hunt provided a welcome feast of fresh meat, a delicious respite from the monotony of salted bacon. It was a sight that spoke of the wild, untamed power of the continent they were crossing. As they pushed deeper into the west, they also encountered the native inhabitants of the land. There was a great deal of fear among the pioneers regarding Native American attacks, fears stoked by sensationalist stories back east. However, the reality on the trail was often quite different. Most encounters were peaceful, centered around trade. The dominant tribe in this region was the Lakota Sioux, a powerful and proud people. They would often approach the wagon trains not with hostility, but with curiosity and a desire to exchange goods. The pioneers traded coffee, sugar, and cloth for moccasins, jerky, and guidance on the trail ahead. On the 4th of July, 1846, the wagon train paused its journey to celebrate Independence Day near Fort Laramie, a major trading post and a key stop on the trail. They created a moment of patriotic normalcy in the heart of the wilderness. They fired their rifles in salute, sang patriotic songs, and shared a special meal. It was a powerful reminder of the nation they still belonged to, a reaffirmation of their identity as Americans, even as they moved farther and farther from its settled borders. Yet, the trail was also a place of constant danger. The journey was incredibly hard on the animals. Oxen and cattle grew weak from the relentless pulling, the lack of good grazing in some areas, and the constant strain. An animal that gave out had to be left behind, a significant loss of investment and power. Accidents were an ever-present threat as well. People, especially children, sometimes fell from the moving wagons and were crushed beneath the heavy wheels. Accidental gunshots were another common and often fatal danger in a community where nearly every man was armed. Life was fragile, and tragedy could strike without warning. As the long days of summer wore on, the vast, grassy plains began to give way to a more rugged and challenging terrain. The air grew thinner and drier as they gained elevation. The Rocky Mountains, the great spine of the continent, loomed on the horizon. The emigrants had successfully crossed the first great obstacle of their journey. They had survived the plains, but now they were arriving at a critical junction, a place where a single decision, a choice between two paths, would alter their destiny forever. The place where their fate was to be decided was a modest fork in the trail at the Little Sandy River in what is now Wyoming. It was here, on July 20th, 1846, that the wagon train faced a choice. One path, the established and well-traveled route, continued northwest before turning southwest toward California. It was the longer road, but it was a known quantity. The other path veered directly south. It was a new route, a supposed shortcut promoted by an ambitious man named Lansford W. Hastings. Hastings was a lawyer and a would-be developer who saw California's future and wanted to be at the center of it. To encourage settlement and bolster his own importance, he had written a book, The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. In its pages, he promoted what he called the Hastings Cutoff. He made an extraordinary claim that his route would shave 350 to 400 miles off the journey to California. For a weary group of travelers, the promise of saving weeks on the trail was an almost irresistible temptation. The problem was that Hastings's claims were dangerously misleading. The cutoff was not shorter. In fact, it was about 125 miles longer than the established trail. More importantly, it led through some of the most difficult and unforgiving terrain on the continent, the rugged Wasatch Mountains and the barren, waterless expanse of the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings himself had only ever traveled the route on horseback, never with the slow, cumbersome wagons that were the lifeblood of the pioneers. His advice was based on theory, not experience. Just as the debate over which route to take was reaching its peak, a lone horseman arrived at their camp. He was a welcome sight, a man who had come from the West and brought news from California. His name was James Clyman, an experienced mountain man and an old friend of James Reed. Clyman's message was a stark and urgent warning. He had just traveled the Hastings Cutoff himself, heading east. He sought out Reed and told him in no uncertain terms to stay on the main trail. He described the supposed shortcut as barely passable even for a man on a horse, let alone a train of heavy wagons with women and children. He warned of brutal mountains and a deadly desert crossing. One might think that such a direct warning from an experienced and trusted friend would have settled the matter. But James Reed was not easily swayed. He was a man of great self-confidence, accustomed to being in charge and making bold decisions. The promise of the shortcut resonated with his ambitious nature. Perhaps he believed his own leadership and the resources of his group could overcome any obstacle. He had Hastings's guidebook, its worn and creased pages filled with promising but false words, and he chose to put his faith in the written word of a promoter over the lived experience of a friend. And so, Reed became a strong advocate for the new route. His enthusiasm was infectious, and he managed to persuade many of the other families. The debate raged around the campfires at night, the sound of anxious, low-voiced arguments drifting on the cool night air. The Donner brothers, known for their cautious and steady nature, were hesitant. But the momentum was with Reed and the promise of a faster journey. A vote was taken. The majority of the families in this smaller group chose to gamble. They would leave the safety of the main train and put their faith in Lansford Hastings. It was at this moment that they officially became the Donner Party. With the decision made to forge their own path, the group elected a captain. Perhaps in a nod to his seniority and steady demeanor, they chose George Donner for the role. It was a responsibility he accepted reluctantly. Approximately 20 wagons, carrying 87 men, women, and children, prepared to split off from the main train. The morning of their separation was a momentous and visually stark occasion. The pioneers watched as the larger main wagon train rumbled off along the well-worn trail, disappearing over the horizon. The sight of them leaving, the dust from their wagons slowly settling, must have been a sobering one. It left the newly formed Donner Party utterly alone, facing a faint and uncertain track that led south into the unknown. The smell of sagebrush, a scent that would come to define their arduous journey ahead, filled the air. Their departure from the established trail was not just a physical turn. It was a symbolic step away from safety and into a wilderness of their own choosing. With their fateful choice made, the Donner Party turned their wagons south, heading toward the imposing mountains and unforgiving deserts that Lansford Hastings had so casually dismissed in his guidebook. Their first major stop was to be Fort Bridger, where they expected to meet Hastings himself, who had promised to guide parties through his cutoff. The hope of meeting their guide gave them a sense of purpose as they pressed on. They arrived at Fort Bridger in late July of 1846, only to be met with their first profound disappointment. The fort was little more than a crude trading post, a pair of log cabins run by the famous mountain man Jim Bridger and his partner Louis Vasquez. More importantly, Lansford Hastings was not there. He had grown impatient waiting for them and had already left with an earlier group, the Harlan Young party. All he had left behind was a note with a new set of instructions, essentially telling the Donner Party to follow his tracks. They were on their own. To make matters worse, both Jim Bridger and his partner seemed to encourage them. They allegedly assured the party that the cutoff was a good route, a fine and level road that would indeed save them time. It is possible they had their own commercial interests at heart. A new, popular trail that passed by their trading post would be good for business. Whatever their motivations, their reassurances, combined with the lingering promises of Hastings's book, were enough to convince the party to press forward. They soon entered the Wasatch Mountains, following the path of the group ahead of them through Echo Canyon. But soon, they found a note left by Hastings, tacked to a shrub. It warned that the route ahead was difficult and advised them to wait for him to return and show them a better way. They waited for over a week, but Hastings never came. Instead, he sent back a man who pointed them in the direction of a supposedly better route, one that Hastings had never even taken himself. This was the beginning of their ordeal. The trail turned out to be nearly non-existent. The terrain was a nightmare for wagon travel. They were forced to navigate a path through what is now called Emigration Canyon, a route choked with dense aspen forests, thick willows, and enormous boulders. The men were forced to become road builders. The jarring sound of their axes echoed through the silent forests day after day as they chopped down countless trees. The smell of pine needles and freshly cut wood mingled with the scent of their own sweat as they performed the exhausting labor of clearing a path. They heaved and pried at massive rocks with levers, clearing a way forward inch by painful inch. The wagons were tilted at precarious angles on the steep slopes, constantly threatening to tip over and send their precious contents crashing down the mountainside. The work was brutal and demoralizing. The pioneers would feel the rough bark of the trees and the sharp edges of the rocks as they cleared the path by hand. Progress slowed to a crawl. On some days, they made less than 2 miles. The path these pioneers took was one of thousands of journeys that have defined human history. As we follow their story, I wonder what other great migrations or epic expeditions from the past would you be curious to explore with us on a future night? Let me know your thoughts in the comments as we press on. This agonizing process of road building took a catastrophic toll on their schedule. It took them 18 grueling days to travel just 36 miles through the Wasatch Range. A normal wagon train on the main trail would have covered over 200 miles in that same amount of time. They had lost a full month, a precious, irreplaceable month, of good weather needed to cross the Sierra Nevada before winter. The optimistic promise of saving time with the cutoff had turned into a cruel deception. The delay was devastating to their resources and their morale. Food supplies, carefully calculated for a shorter journey, were now dwindling at an alarming rate. The animals grew weaker by the day, exhausted by the strain of pulling the heavy wagons up steep inclines and through dense brush. The water supplies had to be carefully rationed in the mountain heat. Tensions within the group, which had been simmering since the debate at the fork in the road, began to boil over. Tempers frayed under the constant strain of physical labor and growing anxiety. The once hopeful community was beginning to fracture under the immense pressure. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity. They emerged from the dark and claustrophobic canyons. They stood at the eastern edge of a vast valley and looked down upon the shimmering expanse of the Great Salt Lake. The sight must have brought a wave of immense relief. They had conquered the mountains. They had survived the first great test of the Hastings cutoff, but their relief was tragically short-lived. As they surveyed the landscape before them, they saw their next great obstacle, an obstacle that Hastings had described as a dry walk of only 40 miles. It was the barren, waterless, and utterly intimidating expanse of the Great Salt Lake Desert. Having emerged from the claustrophobic canyons of the Wasatch Mountains, the Donner Party was greeted by a sight of staggering scale, the Great Salt Lake Valley. But their relief was a fragile, fleeting thing, for before them lay the next great crucible of their journey, an obstacle that would test the very limits of their endurance. It was the Great Salt Lake Desert, an expanse of white, shimmering salt flats that Lansford Hastings, in his infamous guidebook, had dismissed as a mere 40-mile trek, a dry but manageable 2-day crossing. Before they committed their wagons and their lives to the barren waste ahead, they found one last message from the man who had led them here. It was a note left by Hastings for the party that had preceded them, now tattered and torn. Parts of it were illegible, but the message they could decipher was terrifying. In it, Hastings warned that the crossing was far more difficult than he had advertised. The journey, he now admitted, would take 2 days and 2 nights of hard travel. He urged them to pack as much water and grass as they possibly could. It was a shocking contradiction of his own book, a confession of his own recklessness, left on a piece of paper in the middle of nowhere. The warning, as dire as it was, still fell short of the horrifying truth. The desert they were about to cross was not 40 miles, it was 80, and it would not take 2 days, it would take 5. On August 30th, 1846, having gathered what water and feed they could, the Donner Party drove their wagons onto the salt flats. The trap was set. The landscape they entered was alien and surreal. A blinding, featureless plain of white stretched to every horizon. The glare of the sun so intense it was physically painful to look at. The surface itself was a deception. It appeared solid, but it was a thin crust of salt and dried mud over a soft, gummy sludge beneath. The heavy wagons, with their iron-rimmed wheels, broke through this crust almost immediately. They sank into the mire, making progress an agonizingly slow and laborious struggle. The animals strained and the men shouted, but every foot forward was a victory won at a terrible cost. And then there was the silence. It was a profound and unnerving quiet, a complete absence of the normal sounds of life. There were no birds, no insects, no rustle of wind in the grass, because there was no grass. There was only the rhythmic creak of the struggling wagons and the strained breathing of man and beast. The air was thick with the smell of alkaline dust and the sharp, metallic scent of their own sweat. The sun was a merciless tormentor. It beat down from a cloudless sky, and the white salt flats reflected its heat back up at them, cooking them from above and below. Their water supplies, so carefully rationed, dwindled with terrifying speed. Thirst became a living entity, a constant, burning presence. Their lips cracked and bled. Their tongues swelled in their mouths. Dehydration and heatstroke began to claim the weakest among them, leaving them dizzy and delirious in the shimmering heat. And so, their minds began to play tricks on them. Mirages, born of the heat and their desperate longing, flickered at the edges of the horizon. They saw shimmering blue lakes, cool and inviting. They saw groves of green trees and the life-giving flow of rivers. Men would shout and point, their voices hoarse with hope, only to watch the beautiful visions dissolve into wavering heat as they drew closer. It was a psychological torture that was, in some ways, even worse than the physical torment. The pioneers were not the first to suffer here. As they struggled onward, they passed grim evidence of those who had gone before them. The trail was littered with abandoned belongings, heavy furniture, trunks of clothing, and tools cast aside by people desperate to lighten their loads. More chilling were the skeletons of animals, bleached bone-white by the sun, a stark reminder of the desert's toll. But it was the suffering of their own animals that truly broke their hearts and their chances of success. The oxen, their own bodies, racked with thirst, became crazed. The scent of water was everywhere and nowhere, a mirage for their senses as well as for their masters. Some of them, maddened beyond control, simply stampeded, charging off into the white emptiness in a futile search for relief. Others simply wandered away, too weak to be stopped, and were soon lost in the glare. The emigrants could only watch as their engines, their lifeline, the power that was meant to carry them to their new lives, walked away to die. James Reed, the confident organizer of the party, suffered a catastrophic loss. The oxen that pulled his magnificent Pioneer Palace car were among the first to perish. The great wagon, a symbol of his wealth and his unshakable faith in a comfortable journey, became an immovable monument to his folly. There, in the middle of the salt desert, they were forced to abandon it. They unhitched the dead and dying animals and walked away, leaving the two-story wagon to slowly sink into the mud, a ghost of a more hopeful time. In total, the party lost 36 head of cattle in the desert. It was a blow from which they would never recover. It meant they no longer had enough animal power to pull all their remaining wagons. They were forced to make devastating choices, catching some wagons and burying personal possessions, wrapping them in buffalo hides and hoping against hope that they might one day return to retrieve them. When the survivors finally staggered to the far side of the desert and felt the cool, life-giving water of a freshwater spring on their parched lips, there was no celebration. The party was shattered. They were demoralized, critically short on food, and their ability to travel had been crippled. The desert had not killed them, but it had stripped them of their strength, their supplies, and their spirit. Having survived the hellish crossing of the salt desert, the battered remnants of the Donner Party finally rejoined the main California trail. It should have been a moment of relief, a return to a known and proven path. But any sense of comfort was overshadowed by the bitter reality of their situation. The trail followed the course of the Humboldt River across the arid landscape of what is now Nevada. But the river was a sluggish, muddy ribbon of water, and the land around it offered poor grazing for their few remaining animals. They were on the right road, but they were months behind the last of the season's emigrants, and they were in no condition to make up for lost time. Their progress was painfully slow. The oxen and cattle that had survived the desert were skeletal and weak. The people were gaunt and weary, their rations growing smaller with each passing day. The mood in the camp had grown dark. The optimism of Springfield was a distant memory, replaced by a grim and anxious silence. The earlier campfire songs gave way to the sound of angry shouts and bitter accusations. The very air was thick with resentment, much of it directed at James Reed, the man whose advocacy for the cutoff had led them to this state. As if their internal struggles were not enough, the world around them seemed hostile. The local Paiute people, wary and protective of their scarce resources, watched the slow-moving train with suspicion. They were not seeking a large-scale confrontation, but they engaged in a form of guerrilla warfare, using the landscape to their advantage. From a distance, they would occasionally shoot arrows at the pioneers' cattle, further reducing their precious stock of draft animals and food. A man would hear the quiet hiss of an arrow, and another one of his vital oxen would collapse into the dust. This constant, grinding hardship wore away at the civility and social bonds that held the group together. Tempers were short, and patience was non-existent. The feeling of grit and dust in their meager meals was a constant reminder of their harsh, unforgiving environment. It was in this atmosphere of simmering frustration and despair that the fragile unity of the party finally snapped. And so, on October 5, 1846, the simmering tensions erupted into open violence. On a steep, sandy hill, the wagons of two men, James Reed and a teamster named John Snyder, became entangled. It was a common occurrence on the trail, a simple problem that required cooperation. But cooperation was a luxury they could no longer afford. Snyder, enraged, began to furiously beat his oxen with the butt end of his whip. Reed intervened, and the two men exchanged heated words. The argument escalated with terrifying speed. Snyder turned his rage on Reed, striking him hard on the head with his heavy whip handle. Dazed and bleeding, Reed reacted instinctively. He drew a large hunting knife from his belt and plunged it into Snyder's chest. John Snyder staggered back, collapsed, and died within minutes. The camp was thrown into chaos. The acrid smell of gunpowder from other firearms and the shocking sight of blood on the dusty ground transformed the tense community into a fractured mob. What had been a struggle against nature now became a struggle of man against man. Some members of the party, led by a German immigrant named Louis Kesselberg, saw the act as cold-blooded murder. They seized Reed and called for him to be hanged on the spot from the tongue of a wagon. A makeshift trial was held. There was no law here but what they made themselves. Voices were raised in anger. Factions formed. The Donner brothers argued for mercy, but the anger in the camp was a powerful force. In the end, a compromise was reached. They would not hang James Reed. Instead, he would be banished. He was to be cast out from the wagon train, forced to ride ahead alone, and forbidden from seeing his wife and children again. The next morning, Margaret Reed watched in anguish as her husband, unarmed and with no food, rode away from his family, a solitary figure disappearing into the vast, barren landscape. The heart of the party had been ripped out. This brutal event was followed by another act of cold desperation. An elderly Belgian immigrant named Hardcoop, who had been traveling with Kesselberg, was no longer able to keep up. His feet were swollen and cracked, and he could barely walk. No one wanted to spare the energy or the wagon space for a man who could not contribute. He was put out of a wagon and told to walk. He was last seen sitting by the side of the trail, exhausted and alone. He was never seen again. He became the first member of the party to die, a victim not of violence, but of abandonment. Now, they were not just a group of travelers. They were a collection of feuding families, their unity shattered, their most capable leader gone. They were fully aware that they were in a desperate race against the calendar. The snows in the Sierra Nevada were imminent. In a final act of foresight, they had earlier sent two of their strongest men, Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon, to ride ahead to Sutter's Fort in California. They were to get emergency supplies and bring them back. It was a long shot, a desperate plea for help sent out into the wilderness. The survival of everyone now depended on the success of their mission. With their social bonds frayed and their numbers diminished, the fragmented party pushed onward. They were heading for their final, greatest obstacle, the towering granite wall of the Sierra Nevada. As they left the desolate basin of Nevada, the landscape began to change once more. They reached the Truckee River meadows near modern-day Reno. This was the gateway to the mountains. For the first time in months, they saw stands of pine trees, a welcome sign of life after the endless sagebrush. The roaring sound of the clear, cold Truckee River flowing out of the mountains was a powerful contrast to the dead silence of the desert. The air itself felt different. It was crisp and cool, with a clean, sharp smell of pine that hinted at the coming winter. It was here, at the foot of the great mountains, that a miracle occurred. A figure appeared on the trail ahead of them, coming from the west. It was Charles Stanton, one of the two men they had sent for help. He had made it to Sutter's Fort, and he had returned. Stanton's return was like a resurrection. He was not empty-handed. He brought with him 7 mules, loaded with sacks of flour and dried beef, a gift from the generous Captain John Sutter. He also brought 2 Miwok guides, Luis and Salvador, native men sent by Sutter to help the weary emigrants navigate the difficult mountain passes. For a party that had known nothing but loss and despair for months, this was an unimaginable reprieve. The sight of the food, the taste of fresh supplies, sent a wave of hope surging through the exhausted camp. It was a tangible sign that California was real and that salvation was within their grasp. Buoyed by this small mercy, the party made a decision. They would rest. They paused for 5 days in the pleasant meadows to allow their emaciated cattle to regain some strength and for the people to recover their spirits. The weather during this time was deceptively beautiful. The autumn sun was warm, the sky was a brilliant blue, and the threat of winter seemed a distant concern. It seemed a sensible, prudent choice, but it was a fatal one. Had they pushed on immediately, they might have cleared the pass before the weather turned. Those 5 days of rest would cost them everything. After their pause, they began the final ascent, following the Truckee River into the heart of the mountains. The climb was brutally arduous. The trail became so steep and rocky that it was impassable for the wagons. They were forced to disassemble them, unloading their contents and hauling the heavy frames and wheels up sheer cliffs with ropes and chains. It was the last desperate expenditure of their dwindling energy. The imposing view of the granite peaks of the Sierra Nevada loomed over them, looking like an impassable wall of stone. As they struggled upward, tragedy struck again. A well-liked man named William Pike was accidentally killed when a pistol was carelessly handled. His death cast another pall over the group, a reminder that even here, on the cusp of their goal, danger was everywhere. During this torturous climb, the party became further separated. The Donner families, with their older leaders and more numerous small children, had fallen behind the main group. This separation, which began as a few hours, then a day, would soon become a chasm that would seal their different fates. And so, by the end of October, the main party had reached the foot of the final, highest barrier. It was the last pass, a col at over 7,000 feet that stood between them and the gentle descent into the Sacramento Valley. California, the dream that had sustained them for 2,000 miles, was just on the other side. With a sliver of hope renewed by Stanton's supplies, the emigrants made their final attempt on the summit. But as they looked up at the granite wall before them, the sky above began to tell a different, more ominous story. The pioneers were driven by an unshakable belief in a better future, a faith that carried them through immense hardship, as we see them now at their most vulnerable moment. It makes one wonder, what do you believe is the most essential quality for human beings to possess when facing the truly impossible? The date was around October 31st, 1846. As the main group of wagons began the last steep push to the top of the pass, the sky, which had been clear just days before, turned a leaden gray. Then the first snowflakes began to fall. They were large and heavy, drifting down silently at first, almost beautiful in their novelty. But the flurry quickly thickened into a storm, and the gentle descent of snow became a blinding, wind-driven blizzard. The world was rapidly obscured in a curtain of white. The howling sound of the wind whipped through the high mountain pass, a mournful cry that seemed to mock their efforts. A biting cold seeped through their worn, threadbare clothing, chilling them to the bone. The trail before them disappeared under a rapidly deepening blanket of snow. Within hours, the drifts were 5 feet deep, a soft, impassable barrier. They made a desperate, furious attempt to break through. The men shouted themselves hoarse, lashing at the exhausted oxen. The animals, straining and panicked, grunted and heaved, their hooves churning uselessly as they floundered in the deep, powdery snow. The wagons, their wheels clogged and immobilized, refused to budge. The storm was relentless. Visibility dropped to near zero. They could not go forward. With a crushing feeling of defeat, they accepted the inevitable. They had to turn back. They maneuvered the terrified animals and the heavy wagons around, turning away from the summit, away from California, away from their dream. They retreated about 5 miles back, down the eastern side of the mountain, to the edge of a large, frozen lake surrounded by tall pines. It would later be known as Donner Lake. There, by the shore, they found a small, dilapidated cabin, built a year or two earlier by another pioneer party that had wintered there. It was a meager shelter, but it was something. They began to hastily build their own crude shelters, lean-tos and shacks, against the deepening snow. A day or two later, when there was a brief lull in the storm, they made one more attempt on the pass. But the snow was even deeper now, the path completely gone. They were beaten back again, this time with a chilling finality. Meanwhile, the Donner families, several miles behind the main group, were caught in the same storm. An axle on George Donner's wagon broke, forcing them to halt. They were trapped at a different location, a spot near a stream called Alder Creek. The separation was now complete. The Donner party was divided into 2 camps, the Lake Camp and the Creek Camp, a division that would hinder cooperation and seal the fate of many. The storm that had trapped them was not a passing squall. It was the first furious blow of a historically early and severe winter. The snow did not stop. For 8 straight days it fell, burying the landscape, burying their cattle, burying their wagons. As the white drifts rose higher and higher, the full, horrifying reality of their situation began to sink into their minds. The pass was gone. The world was nothing but an endless expanse of white. The race against winter was over. The pioneers had lost. Now, a new struggle was beginning, not a journey of miles across a continent, but a battle for survival against cold, starvation, and the encroaching despair of the closing trap. The race against winter was over. They had lost. The final, desperate push for the summit had ended in a wall of snow, and the retreat to the shores of the frozen lake was not a strategic pause, but a surrender. The great adventure, the 2,000-mile journey powered by dreams of sunshine and golden opportunity, had ground to a halt. Their world, once an ever-expanding horizon, had now shrunk to a few desperate miles of snow-choked forest in the high Sierra. As the first great storm finally subsided after more than a week of relentless snowfall, a profound and muffling silence descended upon the mountains. It was a quiet unlike any they had ever known. The snow, which had fallen with a furious roar, now acted as a blanket, absorbing all sound, creating a world of immense and silent beauty. The pine trees were heavy with it, their branches drooping under the weight of thick white pillows. The lake was a smooth, unbroken sheet of white. The very air seemed crystalline and still. But this beauty was the beauty of a prison. The main body of the party, camped at the lake, had found a small measure of fortune. Here stood 3 small, crude cabins, built 2 years earlier by another pioneer who had been forced to winter in the mountains. These simple log structures became the nucleus of their new, static world. The Brienne family, with their 7 children, took over one cabin. The Murphy and Eddy families crowded into another. The third was occupied by the Graves and the now fatherless Reed family. These were not spacious accommodations. They were small, dark, and smoky, with dozens of people crammed into spaces meant for a handful. Nearby, the Kieseberg family, unable to secure a spot in the main cabins, built a crude lean-to against the side of the Breen cabin, a flimsy shelter offering little protection from the biting cold. For those without a roof, survival meant improvising, creating makeshift tents from wagon covers and blankets, structures that were quickly buried under the accumulating snow. Their world became subterranean. To move between shelters, they had to dig tunnels and trenches through the snowpack, which grew deeper with each passing storm. Soon, the roofs of the cabins were the only part of their world visible above a vast white sea. And so, 6 miles away, at a place called Alder Creek, the Donner families were in an even more desperate situation. Their late start and the broken axle on George's wagon had left them isolated. With no existing structures to occupy, they were living mostly in their makeshift tents, hastily reinforced with pine boughs and whatever materials they could scavenge. Their shelters were less substantial, their situation more precarious. This separation of the 2 camps, a distance made impassable by the deep snow, was a quiet tragedy, hindering communication and mutual support when they needed it most. In those first weeks, a fragile hope still flickered in the cold air. Surely, they thought, this was an early storm, an anomaly. They believed it would pass. The snow would melt enough for another attempt at the pass, and they could continue their journey. California was so close, just on the other side of that white wall. As the days turned into weeks, however, and storm after storm rolled in from the Pacific, this hope began to fade. The snow continued to fall relentlessly. It piled up against their doors, requiring them to constantly dig their way out into the cold, gray light. The accumulation was staggering, reaching over 20 feet in some places, burying their wagons and their dreams under its immense weight. The pioneers took stock of their grim situation. Their first act was to slaughter their remaining oxen. These patient animals had been their partners, the engines of their journey, and now they were to be their sustenance. The meat was harvested and butchered, but preserving it was difficult. They hung strips of beef from the rafters of the smoky cabins, but without salt to properly cure it. It was a race against spoilage. The taste of that tough, stringy boiled beef cooked over a poorly ventilated fire, became the monotonous flavor of their existence. The constant, smoky smell of the green wood fires filled the small cabins, stinging their eyes and coating their lungs, a permanent feature of their new life. A man named Patrick Breen, an Irish immigrant with a quiet, observant nature, began to keep a diary. On the brittle pages of a small notebook, he began to chronicle their ordeal. His entries, written in a simple, direct hand, provide one of the only first-hand accounts of that longest winter. He wrote of the weather, of the depth of the snow, of the health of his family. His words, spare and unemotional, paint a haunting picture of hope slowly giving way to a grim, stoic acceptance. The initial belief that they could still escape was replaced by the dawning, horrifying realization that they were stranded. They were trapped, not just for a week or two, but until the spring, a season that seemed a lifetime away. Confined to their dark, cramped shelters, the pioneers faced a new and insidious enemy. This was not a foe of the trail, not a raging river or a hostile desert, but an enemy that attacked from within. It was the slow, quiet, grinding process of starvation. The body and the mind began to fail in unison, worn down by a hunger that was constant and inescapable. The supply of beef from the slaughtered oxen, which had seemed substantial at first, dwindled with alarming speed. A few weeks of meager rations, and it was gone. Now, their search for sustenance became a truly desperate endeavor. They turned to sources of food that would have been unthinkable just a few months earlier. The tough, leathery ox hides that they had used as roofing material or to protect their belongings were pulled down and boiled. For hours, they would simmer the filthy, hairy skins in pots of water until they dissolved into a foul-tasting, gelatinous glue. The disgusting smell filled the cabins, a constant reminder of what they had been reduced to. This vile substance offered minimal nutrition, but it filled their empty, aching stomachs for a little while. And so, when the hides were gone, they grew even more desperate. They ate whatever they could find. They gnawed on charred bones, cracking them open to get at the tiny morsel of marrow within. They cut the leather laces from their shoes and boiled them until they were soft enough to chew. The small field mice that scurried into the cabins, seeking warmth and crumbs, were a welcome prize, quickly trapped and roasted over the fire. In the darkness of the cabins, the quiet, rhythmic sound of someone gnawing on a bone was a common and haunting noise. Margaret Reed, a woman of remarkable fortitude, had managed to save a small hoard of supplies for her 4 children. Before her husband James had been banished, she had painstakingly packed away a small quantity of beans, some dried apples, a little bacon, and a handful of rice. She had guarded it fiercely, and now she rationed it out with meticulous care, a spoonful at a time, a tiny bit of real food to keep her children alive. Her small treasure was a testament to a mother's foresight and love in the face of unimaginable hardship. The physical effects of malnutrition soon became starkly visible on everyone. Their bodies began to consume themselves. They lost a terrifying amount of weight, their skin stretching tight over their bones, their faces becoming gaunt and hollow-eyed. A profound lethargy set in, a deep, bone-wearying exhaustion that made every small movement a monumental effort. Their minds, starved of energy, grew foggy and slow. Despair and apathy were constant companions, a heavy blanket that threatened to suffocate what little spirit they had left. The children, in particular, suffered immensely. Their small bodies wasted away, and their plaintive cries for food echoed in the small, dark spaces a sound that haunted the silent adults who had nothing to give them. By late November and into the cold heart of December, the inevitable began to happen. The first deaths from starvation occurred. At the lake camp, a hired hand traveling with the reeds, a man named Bayless Williams, was the first to succumb. His passing was quiet, a simple fading away. There was no grand ceremony. His body was wrapped in a sheet and taken out of the crowded cabin to be buried in the deep white snow, a task that exhausted the few men strong enough to perform it. As the days grew shorter and the cold more intense, the grim reality of their situation settled in. The constant, mournful sound of the wind howling outside the cabins was a reminder of their complete and utter isolation. For many, the will to live began to wane, replaced by a quiet, vacant resignation. They were dying, one by one, from a slow hunger in a prison of snow. As the death toll in the dark cabins began to rise, and with no end to the storms in sight, a new idea began to take shape. It was born of the deepest desperation. Waiting for a spring that might never come for them was no longer an option. For the strongest among them, sitting idly by while their families starved was a fate worse than any danger the mountains could hold. They decided that action, however desperate, however hopeless, was their only choice. They would try to walk out. The plan was simple in its conception and staggering in its audacity. They would attempt to cross the summit on foot and reach Bear Valley, one of the first settlements on the western slope of the Sierra. To do this, they would need to walk on top of the 20 feet of soft, deep snow. They began to fashion crude snowshoes, working with frozen fingers and dwindling strength. They used the wooden oxbows from the yokes of their dead cattle for the frames, stretching and weaving strips of leather and hide to create the webbing. The resulting contraptions were heavy, clumsy, and not very effective, but they were their only hope. The group that assembled for this desperate exodus consisted of 17 of the strongest remaining members. There were 10 men and, remarkably, 5 women. Also with them were Luis and Salvador, the 2 Miwok guides who had been sent by Captain Sutter and had faithfully remained with the party. Each person carried meager rations, a small bundle of dried beef and a few ounces of flour, barely enough for 6 days. They had no way of knowing the true distance or the difficulty of the terrain. They believed the journey would take about a week. It would take 33 days. This small, determined band would become known to history as the Forlorn Hope. On December 16, 1846, they said their goodbyes. The women who joined the party were mothers, and their decision was an act of almost unimaginable sacrifice. They were leaving their starving children behind in the dark cabins, gambling their own lives on the slim hope that they could bring back a rescue party to save them. It was a choice that tears at the very heart of human instinct. They kissed their children, wrapped them in thin blankets, and walked out into the heart of the winter storms. Among the men was Charles Stanton. He was the hero who had already made the journey to Sutter S Fort once and had selflessly returned with supplies. He had no family of his own in the camps. He could have stayed in the safety of California, but he had given his word that he would see the pioneers through. And so, he joined the Forlorn Hope, his sense of honor leading him back into the white wilderness. Their departure was a somber, quiet affair. They strapped on their awkward snowshoes and began their trek, a single file line of dark figures against a vast, blindingly white landscape. The awkward, crunching sound of their clumsy snowshoes sinking into the deep powder was the only sound in the silent world. There was no trail to follow, only an unbroken wilderness of snow, rock, and trees. The journey was immediately grueling. The sun, when it appeared, reflected off the endless snow with a painful glare that caused snowblindness, searing their eyes and leaving them half-blind. The feeling of raw, chapped skin from the constant exposure to the wind and snow was a torment. They tasted the last crumbs of their dried beef, a fleeting moment of sustenance before the true hunger began. The forlorn hope had walked out of one prison only to enter another, larger one, a wilderness of white from which few expected to return. As the forlorn hope ventured into the silent white wilderness, those they left behind in the dark, cold cabins could do nothing. Their world had shrunk to the four walls of their shelters, and their lives became a monotonous, suspended state of waiting. They could only wait and pray, and continue their own quiet struggle against the encroaching silence and the slow, relentless hunger. Life in the camps settled into a grim routine where days and nights blurred together into one long twilight of suffering. The oppressive smell of sickness and unwashed bodies hung heavy in the confined, smoky air. The only significant sound from the outside world was the endless moan of the wind. Inside, the dominant sound was often the soft, whimpering cries of hungry children in the cold darkness. It is here that the diary of Patrick Breen becomes our only guide. His pen scratching across the page is one of the few purposeful sounds in the cabin. His entries, famously terse and unemotional, capture the crushing monotony of their existence. He would note the weather, the depth of the snow, the state of their health. "Still snowing," he wrote on one day. "Snow about 8 feet deep, no sign of ceasing." The words are simple, but they convey a world of despair. The children were often too weak to move, let alone play. They would lie listlessly under piles of damp, foul-smelling blankets, their large, hollow eyes watching the firelight flicker on the gaunt faces of their parents huddled nearby. For many, the feeling of deep, bone-wearying lethargy from prolonged starvation was constant. Their world was the size of a single room, their horizon the edge of a dirty blanket. At the Alder Creek camp, the party's elected captain, George Donner, was slowly dying. He had cut his hand while repairing a wagon axle before the snows came, and now the wound was badly infected. He lay in his cold tent, his arms swollen and black with gangrene, growing weaker with each passing day, unable to lead the people who had put their trust in him. Back at the lake, Margaret Reed and her children were among the most desperate. With her husband banished and their own supplies long gone, they were entirely dependent on the charity of others. Yet, even in this darkest of times, there were small acts of human kindness. A family might share a small piece of boiled hide. A scrap of leather might be offered to a crying child. These were small gestures, but they were beacons of humanity in a world that had become utterly inhuman. And so, the pioneers held on to what little they had left. For some, like Patrick Breen, it was faith. His diary often mentions prayer, a quiet turning to God in the face of utter abandonment. For others, it was the simple animal instinct to survive one more day, to see one more sunrise. As the days of December bled into the endless cold of January, a dark and terrible topic, once unthinkable, began to be discussed in hushed, fearful whispers. They began to talk about what they would do when the next person died, what final taboo they might have to break to survive. For 2 long months, from the departure of the forlorn hope until the middle of February, they had no contact with the outside world. They were suspended in time, waiting for a rescue that might never arrive. And so, the great adventure westward had ended, not in the warm sunshine of California, but here, in the cold, silent dark of a mountain winter. The dream of a new life was frozen in time, buried under layers of snow and uncertainty. For the men, women, and children huddled in their makeshift shelters, the world had become a prison of white, and all they could do was endure and wait. Their story, for now, falls silent, a quiet testament to the thin line between ambition and survival. We'll explore what happened next after a short pause. If you are finding some peace in our story tonight, I hope you'll share your thoughts with our community below. While the 87 souls of the Donner Party remained suspended in their prison of snow, caught between life and death, the world outside continued to turn. California, the land of their dreams, was a place of immense change and turmoil, a landscape being actively reshaped by conflict and ambition. And it was into this chaotic world that the first threads of their potential rescue began to be woven, not by a grand expedition, but by the desperate, tireless efforts of a single banished man. James Reed, the confident organizer who had been cast out from the party after the death of John Snyder, had managed to survive his solitary journey. He had endured starvation and hardship, but he had made it through the mountains just before the pass became snowbound. He arrived at Sutter's Fort in late October of 1846, a gaunt and weakened figure, but he was alive. His first thoughts, however, were not of his own recovery, but of the wife and 4 children he had been forced to leave behind. He knew the lateness of the season, and he knew the danger they were in. He immediately tried to organize a rescue. He pleaded for men, for horses, for supplies, to go back into the mountains and bring his family and all the others to safety. But his timing could not have been worse. California in the winter of 1846 was not a place of organized civic aid. It was a territory in the midst of the Mexican-American War. Men and resources were diverted to the conflict. Sutter's Fort itself was a military outpost, its attention focused on skirmishes and strategic control, not on the plight of a single delayed wagon train. Reed's desperate pleas were met with sympathy, but with little in the way of tangible support. Political apathy and the priorities of war formed a wall as impassable as the snow-choked mountains. For months, Reed tried and failed. He joined military actions in the hopes of earning favor and recruits. He traveled from settlement to settlement, his desperation growing with each passing week. The winter was severe, even in the lowlands, and the mountains were spoken of as a place of death, an impenetrable wilderness that had swallowed the last of the year's emigrants. It seemed as though no one could get through. And then, in mid-January of 1847, the situation changed dramatically. A small group of apparitions stumbled out of the foothills of the Sierra and into a small, remote settlement. They were the survivors of the forlorn hope. Of the 17 who had walked out of the camps a month earlier, only 7 remained. There were 2 men and, remarkably, all 5 of the women who had undertaken the journey. They were skeletal, frostbitten, and half-mad from their ordeal, but they were alive, and they brought with them a horrific, electrifying story. Their tale of the snowbound camps, of the starving families, and of their own 33-day journey through a frozen hell, finally broke through the indifference of the Californian authorities and settlers. The abstract idea of a trapped wagon train was now made real by the visceral testimony of these survivors. One of the men, William Eddy, who had been forced to leave his wife and young son behind in the camps, became a key and powerful voice pushing for a rescue. His grief and his fierce determination were impossible to ignore. The news spread. In the burgeoning port town of San Francisco, a public fundraising effort was launched. Citizens, moved by the harrowing accounts, donated money to finance a series of relief parties. The cogs of a rescue operation, so long stalled, finally began to turn. From this renewed effort, the first relief party was formed. It was a small group, just 7 rugged and experienced frontiersmen, led by a man named Daniel Rhodes. They were not soldiers, but volunteers, men accustomed to the harsh realities of the mountains. They left a small outpost called Johnson's Ranch on February 5, 1847, heading east into the same wall of winter that had defeated the Donner Party. Their journey was one of incredible difficulty. Even for these seasoned men, the sheer depth of the snow was a staggering obstacle. They carried heavy packs of food on their backs, but they could not possibly carry enough to feed all the survivors. Their plan was to reach the camps, provide immediate sustenance, and then lead out those who were strong enough to make the journey back. Every step was a struggle against the deep, soft powder and the biting cold. They moved at a crawl, their progress measured in single miles per day. For nearly 2 long weeks, they pushed onward and upward, following the trail markers that were still visible on the trees high above the surface of the snow. Finally, on the 19th of February, after an arduous final climb, they crested a ridge and looked down upon the frozen, silent expanse of Truckee Lake. At first, they saw nothing but an endless field of white. Then, they saw thin plumes of smoke rising from what looked like lumps in the snow. They were the roofs of the buried cabins. They made their way down to the nearest shelter, the Brian cabin. A figure appeared from a hole in the snow, a skeletal woman with wild eyes who stared at them in stunned disbelief. It was Lavina Murphy. Seeing these strong, healthy men appearing like apparitions against the snow, she could only manage to ask a question that perfectly captured the surreal, miraculous nature of their arrival. "Are you men from California?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Or do you come from heaven?" The arrival of the first relief was a moment of profound, earth-shattering change for the survivors. After 4 months of isolation and starvation, hope had returned. The sound of shouts of joy and relief, though weak, echoed across the frozen lake. The rescuers were mobbed by the skeletal inhabitants of the camps, who wept and touched them as if to confirm they were real. The rescuers, in turn, were horrified by what they found. They saw people who were little more than living skeletons, their eyes sunk deep into their skulls, their bodies wasted away. The rescuers opened their packs and distributed the food. For the first time in months, the survivors smelled the aroma of real bread and dried meat. That first taste of sustenance was a powerful, overwhelming experience, a reawakening of senses that had been dulled by long suffering. But this moment of joyous relief was quickly tempered by a somber reality. As the rescuers took stock of the situation, they began to learn just how many had already been lost, how many graves lay hidden beneath the silent snow. The long winter was ending, but the ordeal was far from over. The arrival of the first relief marked the beginning of the end of the long winter. But the process of deliverance was to be a new kind of ordeal, an exodus just as perilous as the entrapment itself. The 7 brave men of the rescue party had brought hope, and they had brought a small amount of food, but they did not have the resources to simply wait for the spring thaw. Their mission was to extract the survivors, to lead them back over the mountains to the safety of the lowlands. This immediately presented them with a series of agonizing choices. They looked at the gaunt, weakened people before them, and knew that not everyone could make the journey. The snow was still deep, the trail was long and difficult, and a winter storm could sweep in at any moment. They had to select those who were strongest, those who had the best chance of surviving the trek out. It was a terrible, necessary calculus of life and death. After distributing what food they could spare to those who would remain behind, the First Relief selected 23 survivors to accompany them. This meant that 21 people, the weakest and the youngest, had to be left behind, with the promise that another relief party was already on its way. This separation was a heartbreaking necessity. Parents had to decide which of their children were strong enough to go and which had to stay. Among those left behind were two of the Reed children, 8-year-old Patty and 3-year-old Tommy. Their mother, Margaret, had been deemed strong enough to make the journey out with her other 2 children, but the 2 youngest were considered too weak. Their father, James Reed, was with the second relief party, still somewhere on the trail, fighting his way toward them. For Margaret Reed, it was an impossible choice, leaving 2 of her children in a place of death, trusting in a rescue that had not yet arrived. The journey of this first group of survivors was a slow, painful procession. It was a long, stumbling line of emaciated people moving through an endless, disorienting expanse of white. The children who were brought along were too weak to walk for any significant distance in the deep snow. The rescuers and the stronger parents were forced to carry them, adding to their own immense burden. The heavy, limp feeling of a weakened child on one's back was a constant, draining reminder of the fragility of their escape. Then, just as they had made it over the summit and were beginning their descent, another massive blizzard hit the mountains. The world once again dissolved into a whiteout, a dizzying, chaotic storm that erased the trail and chilled them to the bone. The sound of the children crying from the cold and the hunger was a constant, heartbreaking refrain against the howl of the wind. In the chaos of the storm, the group became separated and disorganized. Tragedy, which had been their constant companion all winter, followed them on their exodus. A young English emigrant named John Denton, who had bravely struggled on, finally collapsed from exhaustion, his vision failing from snow blindness. The rescuers were too weak to carry him. With deep regret, they had to leave him sitting by a fire under a tree, a quiet, somber moment of surrender to the implacable cruelty of the mountains. He was never seen alive again. The issue of food also created conflict. The rescuers had cached supplies at various points along the trail for their return journey, but some of the starving survivors, driven by months of deprivation, could not control their hunger. They would find the caches and consume more than their share, an act that, while understandable, endangered the entire group. Despite the hardships, the group pressed on. Their progress was agonizingly slow. And then, amidst the snow and the suffering, another miracle occurred. They encountered the second relief party, which was making its way up the mountain, and at the head of that party was James Reed. The reunion was a moment of profound, overwhelming emotion. Reed, who had been banished months before, was joyfully, miraculously reunited with his wife, Margaret, and the 2 children she had with her. It was a moment of pure relief that stood in stark contrast to the tragedy surrounding them. But the reunion was also bittersweet. Reed learned that his 2 youngest children were still at the camp, left behind because they were too weak. After ensuring his wife and the other survivors were in the care of his companions, James Reed did not turn back toward the safety of California. His own rescue mission was not yet complete. He turned his face back toward the mountains and continued on toward the lake, determined to save the children he had been forced to leave. While James Reed and the Second Relief pressed on toward the desolate camps, the story turns to the grim discoveries that awaited them, and the final, harrowing rescue of those left behind. The ordeal was not yet over, and its darkest chapters were only now being fully revealed. At the end of February, James Reed and the Second Relief Party finally reached the shores of Truckee Lake. The camp they found was even more desperate than the one the first party had encountered. The small bit of food that had been left behind was long gone, and the remaining survivors were in the final stages of starvation. For Reed, the moment was one of both horror and profound relief. He found his two children, Patty and Tommy, still alive. They had been cared for by the other families, but they were weak and emaciated. He gathered them up, his mission to reunite his family almost complete. The Second Relief was able to evacuate 17 more survivors from the lake camp. But again, the brutal arithmetic of rescue came into play. Some were still too weak to move, and the relief party did not have the manpower to carry them all. Among those left behind this time was the Brian family and the gravely ill members of the Graves family. At the Alder Creek camp, the situation was even worse. The rescuers found that the patriarch of the party, George Donner, had finally succumbed to the infection in his hand. He had passed away quietly in his tent. His wife, Tamsin Donner, was still alive and relatively healthy. The rescuers pleaded with her to come with them to save herself, but she refused. Her 3 young daughters were with the rescue party, and she knew they would be taken to safety. Her duty, she felt, was to remain with her dying husband. It was an act of incredible love and devotion. The image of her calm, determined face as she made this choice to stay in a place of death to comfort her husband in his final hours is one of the most poignant and heroic moments in the entire saga. She entrusted her children to the care of others and was never seen alive again. In mid-March, the Third Relief Party, co-led by the forlorn hope survivor William Eddy, made it to the camps. What they found was a scene of unparalleled horror. With the spring sun beginning to melt the edges of the snowpack, the grim detritus of the winter was being revealed. They found a camp that was no longer just a place of starvation, but a place of survival at any cost. There was clear, undeniable evidence of cannibalism. The rescuers were hardened frontiersmen, but they were deeply shaken by the unsettling silence of the camps. A quiet punctuated only by the wind and by the grim tableau of what had been necessary for the last few to survive. This Third Relief managed to rescue 4 of the last remaining survivors, shepherding them out of the mountains. But even then, the story was not quite over. In April, a 4th Relief was organized. It was often called the Salvage Party, as its primary mission was to recover the valuable property that the pioneers had been forced to abandon and cache. They expected to find the camps empty, a place of ghosts. Instead, they found one last survivor, huddled in one of the cabins, living alone amongst the dead for weeks, was Louis Kesselberg. He was a gaunt, wild-looking figure, the last man in a place that had become a tomb. His survival was a source of dark speculation. He was immediately accused of having murdered Tamsin Donner for the money she was rumored to be carrying. It was a charge he would vehemently deny for the rest of his long and troubled life, but the accusation would follow him, turning him into the villain of the Donner Party story. a reputation from which he could never escape. With the rescue of Louis Kesselberg, the ordeal in the mountains was finally, truly over. Of the approximately 87 men, women, and children who had become trapped by the snows in late October, only about 48 had survived. The survivors were taken, one by one, to the sanctuary of Sutter's Fort. There, in the warm, gentle feel of the California sunshine, they began the long and difficult process of physical and emotional recovery. The journey was over, but the echoes of the snow would remain with them forever. Out of the mountains and back in the world of the living, the survivors of the Donner Party now faced a different kind of challenge. It was no longer a fight for physical survival, but a struggle to build a new life while carrying the impossibly heavy weight of what they had endured. The Reed family, in a remarkable testament to their resilience, was the only family from the original Springfield group to survive without a single loss. They settled in the small but growing community of San Jose, California. James Reed, using his business acumen, became a prominent and successful citizen, playing a key role in the development of the new state. They had lost their fortune in the snows, but they rebuilt their lives with a quiet determination. One of their daughters, Virginia, who was a teenager during the ordeal, later wrote a long letter to her cousin back in Illinois, detailing their journey. Her account is one of the most valuable historical documents of the event, and she ended it with a piece of simple, hard-won advice for any future pioneers. "Never take no cut-offs," she wrote, "and hurry straight through." The three young Donner girls, orphaned by the deaths of their parents at Alder Creek, were taken in by an elderly couple at Sutter's Fort and were raised in a new land without the family they had started with. Like many of the child survivors, they went on to live long, full lives, but they rarely, if ever, spoke publicly of their experiences in the mountains. The trauma was something they carried in silence. William Eddy, the heroic member of the Forlorn Hope who had lost his wife and son, eventually remarried and tried to rebuild his life. But those who knew him said he was a man forever changed, haunted by the ghosts of his past. And Louis Kesselberg, the last man out of the mountains, lived a life of ostracism. The accusations of murder and his association with the darkest acts of survival clung to him like a shroud. He lived as an outcast, a lonely figure forever defined by his time in the snow. The story of the Donner Party itself quickly became a national sensation. Newspapers and cheap dime novels seized upon the most gruesome details, often sensationalizing the tragedy and turning the complex human story into a simple horror tale. The survivors found themselves objects of a grim and intrusive curiosity. In time, the world moved on. The California gold rush brought a new wave of emigrants over the Sierra, and the trail the Donners had struggled on became a well-traveled highway. The site of the camps at Truckee Lake is now a California historical landmark, a state park where visitors can walk among the tall pines and reflect on the events that transpired there. The quiet, reflective expressions on the faces of the elderly survivors, captured in photographs taken many years later, tell a story of profound loss, but also of a deep and abiding strength. The legacy of the Donner Party is complex. It serves, of course, as a grim cautionary tale, a lesson in the consequences of impatience and hubris, reinforcing to all future emigrants the importance of good timing and adherence to proven routes. But to see it only as a story of failure and horror is to miss the deeper truth. It is also a story of incredible human endurance. It is a story of sacrifice, of mothers who gave their lives for their children, of men who returned to the mountains to honor a promise. It is a story of the unbreakable bonds of family that persisted even in the face of the ultimate deprivation. The survivors, in their quiet continuation of life, showed a profound resilience. They went on to build homes, raise families, and contribute to the founding of a new state. Their lives a testament to the human capacity to endure the unthinkable and still find a way to live. The sight of orchards and thriving towns, the sound of marketplaces and children playing, the simple feel of a warm bed and clean clothes. These ordinary things must have seemed like daily miracles to them, simple luxuries they would never again take for granted. The echoes of the Donner Party's footsteps have long since faded from the mountain pass, but their story remains etched into the landscape of American history. It serves as a profound meditation on the human spirit, its capacity for hope, its vulnerability to error, and its incredible, unyielding strength in the face of the absolute worst. Their journey reminds us that even in the deepest, darkest winter, the promise of spring and of survival endures. I hope this reflection has been a peaceful one for you. As our story has unfolded, we have followed the path of one particular group of travelers, their journey a singular thread in a much larger tapestry of migration. But to truly understand their world, we must now gently pull back, to look not at the individual thread, but at the vast and intricate pattern of the westward expansion itself. In this final part of our journey together, we will explore the wider world of the pioneer, the tools they used, the landscapes they crossed, and the great ideas that moved them. This is a quiet exploration, a gentle epilogue, designed to offer a peaceful reflection on a time that has long since passed into memory. Let us begin with the single most essential piece of technology for any overland emigrant, the vessel that was both their transportation and their home, the iconic covered wagon. The image that often comes to mind is that of the immense, heavy Conestoga wagon, a true giant of the road used for hauling freight in the eastern states. But the wagon that truly conquered the West was a different vehicle altogether. It was a smaller, lighter, and more nimble creation, a simple farm wagon adapted for the immense journey. It was often called the Prairie Schooner, a wonderfully poetic name derived from the sight of its white canvas top, which from a distance looked like the sail of a ship gliding across the vast grassy ocean of the American plains. The construction of these wagons was a marvel of 19th century craftsmanship, a testament to the elegant utility of wood and iron. The wagon bed, the central container for a family's entire worldly possessions, was typically about 10 feet long and 4 feet wide. It was not a simple box, but a carefully designed structure. The sides were often angled outwards, making the top wider than the bottom, which helped to prevent the contents from shifting and spilling on rough terrain. The floorboards were thick and sturdy, built to withstand the constant jolting and vibration of a 2,000-mile journey. And so, beneath this bed was the undercarriage, a complex assembly of axles, bolsters, and the all-important wheels. These wheels were a work of art in themselves. They were constructed from the hardiest and most carefully selected woods available. The hubs were often made of tough elm, the spokes of resilient hickory, and the outer rims, or felloes, of dense, strong white oak. Each type of wood was chosen for its specific properties, its ability to bear weight, absorb shock, and endure the extreme dryness of the plains and deserts. Surrounding this masterful woodwork was a rim of iron, a tire that had to be heated until it expanded, fitted onto the wooden wheel, and then rapidly cooled so that it would shrink and bind the entire assembly with immense force. This process had to be repeated periodically along the trail, a task for a skilled blacksmith, as the dry air would shrink the wood and loosen the iron rims. Above the wagon bed rose the 5 or 6 curved wooden boughs that gave the wagon its distinctive covered shape. Over this framework, the canvas cover was stretched taut. This cover was usually made from a heavy-duty cotton fabric known as duckcloth, and it was often waterproofed with a coating of linseed oil, which gave it a slightly translucent, yellowish hue. This simple canvas roof was the pioneers' only reliable shelter from the blistering sun, the sudden thunderstorms, and the biting winds of the open plains. Packing such a wagon for a journey of 4 to 6 months was nothing short of a science. It was a careful puzzle of weight distribution and access. The heaviest items had to be placed at the very bottom and in the center of the wagon bed. This included large, heavy barrels of flour and water, sacks of beans, and crates of bacon. This created a low center of gravity, making the wagon more stable and less likely to tip over on a steep hillside or a rocky passage. Lighter items, such as clothing, bedding, and cooking utensils, were packed on top and around the heavier goods. Items that were needed daily, like a coffee pot, a skillet, or a water bucket, were often hung from hooks on the outside of the wagon for easy access. It is a common misconception that the pioneers rode inside these wagons, enjoying a leisurely journey across the continent. The reality was quite the opposite. The ride inside a springless wagon on a rough, unpaved trail was incredibly bumpy and uncomfortable. More importantly, every square inch of space was precious, needed for the supplies that meant the difference between life and death. And finally, the animals were already pulling a tremendous load. A typical farm wagon, when fully loaded with the provisions for a family of 4, could weigh up to 2,500 pounds. To add the weight of the people would have been an unnecessary and cruel strain on the animals. And so, for the vast majority of the journey, the pioneers walked. Men, women, and older children walked alongside the slow-moving wagons, covering 10 to 15 miles a day on their own 2 feet. Only the very young, the elderly, or the sick were permitted to ride inside. The engine for this mobile home was a team of 2 to 6 animals, most commonly oxen. While some pioneers preferred mules for their greater speed and intelligence, oxen were the more popular choice for several key reasons. They were slower, but they were incredibly strong and steady. Their pace, a reliable, plodding rhythm that could be maintained all day. They were also hardier, better able to survive on the sparse grazing of the plains. And, in a practical consideration, they were less likely to be stolen by horse thieves, as they were not as valuable as mules or horses. Finally, strapped to the side of the wagon, there was always a toolbox. This box contained the essential items for the constant repairs the wagon would inevitably need. It held a bucket of pine tar, a thick, sticky substance used to lubricate the axles and hubs, reducing the friction of the turning wheels. The rich smell of this pine tar was a constant and defining aroma of the wagon train. The toolbox also held spare parts, lengths of chain for difficult river crossings or steep ascents, and the basic tools needed to keep their entire world from falling apart. The prairie schooner was more than just a vehicle. It was the pioneers' ark, their castle, and their entire universe. A self-contained vessel carrying all their hopes for the future within its simple wooden frame. with their sturdy wagon serving as their vessel. The pioneers faced the monumental task of provisioning it for a journey that would last for months, across a landscape that offered little in the way of reliable sustenance. The choices they made before leaving the jumping-off points in Missouri would directly determine their chances of survival. This was not a simple shopping trip. It was a carefully calculated investment in life itself, a process that required immense foresight and a deep understanding of the practicalities of self-sufficiency. The foundation of any pioneer's larder was a small collection of calorie-dense, non-perishable staples. The guidebooks of the era offered specific recommendations, and most families followed them closely. For each adult in the party, the basic food ration for the 6-month journey was staggering in its scale. It began with 200 pounds of flour, usually packed in sturdy, watertight barrels. This was the raw material for the daily bread, the most essential food item on the trail. Alongside it was 150 pounds of bacon. This cured meat was chosen not just for its longevity, but for its high-fat content, providing the immense energy needed for the physical labor of the journey. The bacon was often packed in large barrels and surrounded by a thick layer of bran, which helped to absorb the grease and keep the meat from spoiling in the summer heat. To this foundation, other essentials were added. 20 pounds of coffee was considered a necessity, not a luxury. The ritual of brewing coffee over a campfire in the pre-dawn quiet was a vital comfort, a moment of warmth and normalcy in a life of constant motion. The sound of a hand-cranked coffee grinder was often the first sound to break the silence of the camp each morning, and the rich, comforting smell of the roasting beans was a small pleasure that helped to fortify the spirit for the day ahead. 40 pounds of sugar, 20 pounds of salt, and a large sack of dried beans or peas completed the core provisions. Many also brought rice, dried fruit like apples or peaches, and a keg of vinegar, which was used for pickling, cleaning, and medicinal purposes. And so, to cook these simple ingredients, every family relied on a small but versatile set of tools. The single most important piece of cookware was the Dutch oven. This heavy cast-iron pot with a flat-lipped lid was the pioneer's all-in-one kitchen. It could be used for boiling beans, frying bacon, or stewing freshly hunted game. Its greatest trick, however, was baking. By placing the oven over a bed of hot coals and shoveling more coals onto its flat lid, it created a uniform heat that could bake delicious, crusty sourdough bread in the middle of the wilderness. The simple, hearty taste of this bread, fresh from the ashes of a campfire, was a profound comfort, a taste of home in a vast and alien landscape. The heavy, solid feel of that cast-iron pot was the feel of survival itself. Clothing, like the food, was chosen for practicality and durability, not fashion. The common fabrics were wool and linen, materials that were strong, breathable, and could withstand constant wear and tear. Multiple layers were essential. A pioneer might start the day in a heavy wool coat against the morning chill, shed layers during the heat of the afternoon, and then bundle up again as the sun set over the plains. Every person had at least one change of sturdy clothes and several pairs of well-made boots, as they would be walking for the better part of 2,000 miles. Tools were as vital as food. Every family carried an arsenal for both the journey and their future life. An axe was indispensable for clearing trails and chopping firewood. A shovel was needed for digging fire pits, leveling campsites, and, on grim occasions, for digging graves. Lengths of heavy rope and chain were essential for navigating the many challenges of the trail, and packed away carefully were the farming implements they would need to begin their new life in California or Oregon: a plow, a scythe, and seeds for their first crops. Every man and many women also knew how to use a rifle or shotgun, which was carried for hunting the abundant game of the plains, and for protection in a land without established law. Medical supplies were rudimentary at best. A typical medical kit contained common 19th century remedies like castor oil, a powerful laxative, Epsom salts for aches and pains, and perhaps some quinine to combat the fevers that were common on the trail. For the most part, the pioneers had to rely on their own resilience and folk remedies. Finally, amidst all these practical necessities, most families found a small amount of space for a few cherished personal items, a tangible link to the life they had left behind. It might be a heavy, leather-bound family Bible, its pages filled with the records of births and deaths. It could be a small musical instrument, like a fiddle or a harmonica, to bring a bit of music and joy to the lonely campfire nights. Or it might be a set of fine china, each piece carefully wrapped in linen and nested in a sturdy crate, a symbol of the civilized life they hoped to rebuild at the end of their long journey. These items were a burden, but they were a necessary one, a reminder that they were not just surviving, but carrying a culture and a future with them in their small, creaking wagons. The carefully packed supplies in the prairie schooners were the pioneers' armor against the uncertainties of the trail. But the journey itself was a slow, immersive passage through the vast and varied landscapes of the untamed American West. For the emigrants, most of whom came from the rolling hills and dense forests of the East and Midwest, the sheer scale and emptiness of the continent was a revelation, a sight that inspired both awe and a deep, primal fear. Their journey began on the Great Plains, a landscape that was often dismissed in the guidebooks of the time as the Great American Desert. But this was a profound misunderstanding of a rich and complex ecosystem. The plains were not a uniform, barren wasteland. They were a mosaic of different prairies, their character changing with the subtle shifts in rainfall and elevation. The journey began in the tallgrass prairie, a sea of grass that could grow taller than a man on horseback, a thick green jungle that waved and rolled in the wind. This was a land of deep, rich soil, a promise of the agricultural paradise that many sought. As they moved farther west, this gave way to the mixed grass, and then the short grass prairie, a drier, more sparse environment, but one that supported the single most awe-inspiring spectacle of the 19th century. American landscape, the great herds of the American bison. It is estimated that somewhere between 30 and 60 million of these massive animals roamed the plains. The pioneers described seeing herds that stretched from horizon to horizon, so vast that they could take days to pass a single point. The low, rumbling sound of their hooves was like distant thunder, a sound that made the very earth tremble. These herds were a vital resource for fresh meat, but they were also a force of nature that commanded deep respect. And so, this vast, open land was cut through by powerful rivers, which presented some of the greatest dangers of the entire journey. Rivers like the Platte, the Kansas, and the Sweetwater had to be crossed. If the water was low, it was a simple matter of fording, but if it was high and swift, the wagons had to be transformed into makeshift boats. The wheels were removed, and the wagon beds were caulked with tar to make them watertight. They were then floated across, a precarious and often chaotic process that could easily lead to lost wagons, supplies, and even lives. After the plains came the next great barrier, the Rocky Mountains. For the pioneers, this was a dramatic and often frightening transition. They moved from a world of horizontal immensity to one of vertical grandeur. The trail wound its way through high mountain passes where the air grew thin and sharp. The clean, crisp smell of the high-altitude air was a welcome change from the dust of the plains. But the challenges here were immense. The weather could change in an instant, with a sunny summer afternoon suddenly giving way to a violent hailstorm or even a dusting of snow. The steep ascents and descents were brutally hard on the animals and the wagons. Beyond the Rockies lay the Great Basin, the vast, arid region between the mountains. This is a land of internal drainage, a place where the rivers do not flow to the sea, but instead disappear into salt flats and alkaline sinks. Here, the pioneers encountered the intense, dry heat radiating from the desert floor. The Humboldt River in what is now Nevada was a crucial but difficult lifeline through this desert. It was a slow, muddy, and often foul-tasting river, and the land around it offered little in the way of grazing for their weary animals. It was a grim, monotonous landscape that tested the spirits of even the most determined travelers. This whole world was teeming with a wide range of wildlife, much of it completely new to the pioneers. They saw vast, barking towns of prairie dogs, the sleek and impossibly fast pronghorn antelope, and they lived with the constant howling presence of wolves on the periphery of their camps. In the mountains, the threat of grizzly bears was a real and terrifying concern. The trail they created was a permanent scar on this ancient landscape, the passage of thousands of wagons, all following the same path, cut deep ruts into the prairie soil and the desert floor. In some quiet, untouched parts of the American West, these ruts are still visible today, a faint, ghostly trace of the Great Migration. The pioneers' perception of this incredible world was, by necessity, shaped by utility. They were not tourists admiring the view. They were survivors, constantly scanning the horizon for the three essential elements of life on the trail: fresh water for themselves and their animals, good grazing land, which they called forage, and a reliable source of fuel for their fires, be it scarce wood or the dried buffalo chips that littered the plains. And yet, one cannot read their diaries without sensing the profound impact that this landscape had on their souls. The sight of a fiery red sunset over the perfectly flat horizon, or the staggering beauty of a clear, star-filled night sky, untouched by any form of light pollution, were experiences that they carried with them for the rest of their lives. This vast and beautiful landscape, which to the pioneers often seemed empty and awaiting their arrival, was, of course, anything but. It was the homeland of numerous Native American peoples, whose lives and cultures had been shaped by these plains, mountains, and deserts for centuries. But in the minds of many 19th-century Americans, the continent was a blank slate, a canvas upon which a new destiny was to be painted. This powerful belief, a mixture of faith, nationalism, and economic ambition, was the invisible force that propelled the wagons westward. It was an idea known as manifest destiny. The term itself was first coined in 1845 by a journalist named John L. O'Sullivan. But the idea had been a current in the American air for much longer. At its core, manifest destiny was the belief that the United States was divinely ordained, that it was its clear and unavoidable fate to expand its dominion and its institutions across the entire North American continent. It was a powerful and compelling ideology that framed westward expansion not as a choice, but as a duty, a sacred mission assigned by a higher power. This philosophy was a potent combination of several distinct ideas. It was rooted in a fierce American nationalism, a pride in the nation's democratic institutions, and a belief that they were superior to any other form of government. It also contained a strong undercurrent of cultural and, at times, racial superiority, a conviction that the Anglo-Saxon peoples were uniquely equipped to tame the wilderness and bring progress to the continent. The expansion was therefore seen by its proponents not as an act of conquest, but as a benevolent mission, a way of spreading freedom, democracy, and technological progress to the less developed corners of the world. This grand philosophical idea was closely tied to a much more practical and personal promise, the lure of cheap, fertile land. For millions of ordinary Americans, the West represented a chance for economic independence, an opportunity to own a farm and build a prosperous life that might be out of reach in the more crowded and stratified society of the East. Manifest Destiny provided a moral and patriotic justification for this powerful economic impulse. It transformed a personal quest for a better life into a contribution to a great national project. Perhaps the most famous visual representation of this idea is an 1872 painting by John Gast titled American Progress. The painting depicts a celestial female figure, Columbia, representing the United States, floating westward across the landscape. In her hands, she carries a school book, a symbol of enlightenment, and she trails telegraph wires, a symbol of modern communication. Before her, the darkness of the wilderness gives way to light. Native Americans and herds of buffalo flee into the shadows, while behind her follow the agents of progress, farmers, miners, stagecoaches, and railroads, all moving toward the golden promise of the setting sun. It is a powerful piece of propaganda, capturing the essence of the Manifest Destiny ideal. The pioneers themselves, the men and women walking beside their wagons, may not have thought in such grand philosophical terms every day. Their concerns were more immediate: finding water, fixing a broken axle, caring for a sick child. But they were, without a doubt, the agents of this national project. The idea that their journey was part of a larger, noble destiny was a powerful motivator, a source of strength that helped them endure the immense hardships of the trail. The legacy of Manifest Destiny is, of course, deeply complex. It is inextricably tied to the growth, power, and prosperity of the modern United States, but it is also tied to the immense suffering it caused. It was the ideology used to justify the Mexican-American War, which resulted in the United States acquiring vast territories, including California. And it was the philosophical underpinning for the systematic and often violent displacement of Native American tribes from their ancestral lands. While a powerful and inspiring idea for the settlers, it was a devastating and destructive one for the peoples who already called the West their home. Considering this complex history is a quiet, contemplative act, a way of understanding the many forces that shaped the world we know today. The idea, like the pioneers it inspired, has now receded into the annals of history, a concept for us to ponder as our journey comes to its final, gentle close. Our journey tonight, from the hopeful plains of Illinois to the solemn peaks of the Sierra Nevada and beyond, has come to its end. The story of the Donner Party and the wider world of the pioneers speaks to the incredible complexities of the human drive to explore, to dream, and to endure. Thank you for joining us here at Sleeping Scribe. It is my deepest wish that this story has brought you some comfort and calm. If you've enjoyed our time together, please consider subscribing to the channel for more journeys into the past. Your support allows these stories to be told. I hope your night is filled with peace and that your dreams are sweet. Until next time, rest well.